Title: The Haunting of Mrs. Everhart. In the tranquil suburb of Maplewood, amidst rows of neatly aligned houses, stood the unassuming abode of Mrs. Everhart. A widow in her twilight years, Mrs. Everhart shared her home with her son, Robert, and his wife, Victoria. Yet, behind the facade of suburban serenity, an unsettling tension lurked within the confines of their residence. Victoria, possessed of delicate features and an icy demeanor, nursed a profound resentment towards her mother-in-law. From the moment she crossed the threshold into the Everhart household, Victoria's antipathy towards Mrs. Everhart was unmistakable. She regarded her presence as an unwelcome intrusion, a burden to be endured rather than embraced. Despite Victoria's disdain, Mrs. Everhart, her form stooped with age but her spirit unyielding, navigated the labyrinth of her daughter-in-law's animosity with a quiet grace. Yet, Victoria's mistreatment of Mrs. Everhart went unchecked behind closed doors. She withheld sustenance, neglected her care, and subjected her to a ceaseless barrage of verbal assaults. As days stretched into weeks, the rift between Victoria and Mrs. Everhart widened, casting a shadow over the Maplewood home. Victoria's mistreatment of her mother-in-law escalated with each passing day, fueled by a potent blend of resentment and indifference. Victoria's acts of neglect became increasingly cruel and calculated. She would conveniently forget to provide Mrs. Everhart with meals, leaving her to languish in hunger while Victoria indulged in lavish repasts. Bare necessities such as bathing and grooming were relegated to the periphery of Victoria's priorities, leaving Mrs. Everhart to suffer the indignity of neglect. Yet, it was not merely physical neglect that Mrs. Everhart endured at the hands of Victoria. The venomous words that dripped from Victoria's lips inflicted wounds far more profound than any physical ailment. Mrs. Everhart, once a pillar of strength, found herself wilting under the weight of Victoria's verbal assaults, her spirit battered and bruised. Despite the mounting evidence of her mother-in-law's declining health, Victoria remained steadfast in her indifference. Oblivious to the toll her actions were exacting, she continued to go about her days, disregarding Mrs. Everhart's well-being. Meanwhile, Robert, ensnared in the web of his professional obligations, remained blissfully unaware of the turmoil brewing within the walls of his home. Blinded by his own pursuits, he failed to recognize the signs of discord festering under his own roof. Within the confines of the Maplewood home, an eerie silence prevailed, punctuated only by the hollow echoes of Victoria's neglect and Mrs. Everhart's silent suffering. Like a festering wound left untended, the animosity between Victoria and Mrs. Everhart festered, biding its time until it could erupt into a tempest of darkness that would consume them all. As the days turned into months, Victoria's resentment towards Mrs. Everhart deepened, fermenting into a toxic brew of malice and cruelty. No longer satisfied with mere neglect, Victoria's actions turned sinister as she descended further into the abyss of her own bitterness. With a chilling calculation, Victoria began to devise increasingly cruel methods to torment her mother-in-law. She took perverse pleasure in Mrs. Everhart's suffering, relishing the power she wielded over the vulnerable woman. Meals became a weapon in Victoria's arsenal, with each morsel tainted by her malicious intent. Mrs. Everhart, weakened by hunger and despair, could do little but endure the torment inflicted upon her. The once proud matriarch, who had weathered life's storms with stoic resilience, now lay bedridden, a mere shell of her former self. Victoria's neglect had taken its toll, leaving Mrs. Everhart frail and vulnerable, her spirit broken by the cruelty of her daughter-in-law. Yet, the depths of Victoria's depravity indeed revealed the extent of her malevolence. In a twisted act of sadism, Victoria began to feed Mrs. Everhart worms, relishing in the sight of her mother-in-law's revulsion and disgust. The grotesque spectacle was a testament to Victoria's descent into madness, fueled by her insatiable desire to break Mrs. Everhart's spirit once and for all. For Mrs. Everhart, each day became a living nightmare, her existence defined by pain and suffering at the hands of the woman who had sworn to love and honor her. Her once warm and inviting home had become a prison, its walls closing in around her as she awaited her inevitable fate. And yet, amidst the darkness that engulfed her, a flicker of defiance remained. Though battered and broken, Mrs. Everhart's spirit refused to be extinguished. With each passing day, the embers of her resilience burned brighter, fueled by a steely determination to survive, no matter the cost. But little did Victoria know that her cruel actions would soon unleash forces beyond her comprehension, forces that would set into motion a chain of events that would lead to her own undoing. For in her quest to break Mrs. Everhart's spirit, Victoria had unwittingly awakened something far more sinister, something that would exact a terrible price for her sins. The tension within the Maplewood home reached its boiling point on a fateful evening, shrouded in darkness and malice. Victoria, consumed by her seething hatred for Mrs. Everhart, descended into a frenzy of violence that would forever stain the walls of their home with blood. It began with a metal ladle, innocuous in appearance, but transformed into a weapon of unimaginable cruelty in Victoria's hands. With a primal rage burning in her eyes, she unleashed a torrent of blows upon Mrs. Everhart, the sound of metal meeting flesh reverberating through the silent halls of the house. Each strike of the ladle sent shockwaves of pain coursing through Mrs. Everhart's frail body, and her cries drowned out by the deafening cacophony of her daughter-in-law's fury. Blood spattered across the pristine floors, painting a macabre tableau of violence and despair. But Victoria's rampage did not end there. With a sickening determination, she seized the ladle by its handle and, with a savage gleam in her eyes, proceeded to inflict unspeakable horrors upon her helpless victim. With cruel precision, she gouged out Mrs. Everhart's eyes, the sound of flesh tearing mingling with the woman's agonized screams. Yet, Victoria's depravity knew no bounds. With a cold, calculating efficiency, she forced the end of the ladle down Mrs. Everhart's throat, silencing her cries for mercy as she choked the life from her body. The metallic taste of blood combined with the bile rising in Mrs. Everhart's throat, a final indignity inflicted upon her by the woman who had sworn to protect her. As the last vestiges of life faded from Mrs. Everhart's eyes, Victoria stood over her broken body, a perverse satisfaction twisting her features into a grotesque mask of triumph. In that moment, she believed herself victorious, the victor in a twisted game of dominance and submission. But as the echoes of her violence faded into the stillness of the night, a sense of unease settled over the Maplewood home, as if the very walls themselves recoiled in horror at the atrocities that had been committed within their confines. For in that moment of triumph, Victoria had unleashed forces beyond her comprehension that would soon come to claim their terrible retribution. In the wake of Mrs. Everhart's brutal demise, a sinister pall descended upon the Maplewood home, casting its shadow over Victoria like a shroud of dread. As the night enveloped the house in its cold embrace, Victoria found herself plagued by strange and unsettling occurrences, the echoes of her violent deeds reverberating through the empty halls. At first, it was subtle, a flicker of movement out of the corner of her eye, a whisper on the edge of her consciousness. But soon, these fleeting glimpses gave way to something far more malevolent, a presence that lurked in the darkness, biding its time with a patience born of vengeance. It began with whispers, barely audible murmurs that echoed through the stillness of the night. Victoria would awaken to the sound of her name being whispered in hushed tones, her heart pounding in her chest as she searched the empty rooms for the source of the haunting refrain. But it was not only in the dead of night that Mrs. Everhart's vengeful spirit made itself known. During the day, when Victoria was alone in the house, she would feel a chill settle over her as if an unseen presence lingered just beyond the periphery of her vision. Objects would move of their own accord, doors would slam shut with a resounding clang, and the air seemed to thrum with an otherworldly energy. Yet, the apparition of Mrs. Everhart herself truly struck terror into Victoria's heart. In the dim light of the evening, she would catch glimpses of a shadowy figure moving through the house, its form twisted and contorted in a grotesque parody of humanity. The eyes that once sparkled with life now glowed with an otherworldly light, pouring into Victoria's soul with an intensity that chilled her to the bone. But it was not only the sight of Mrs. Everhart's ghostly form that filled Victoria with dread, it was the feeling of her presence, an oppressive weight that seemed to suffocate her very soul. In those moments, Victoria could feel the tendrils of Mrs. Everhart's rage reaching out to ensnare her, to drag her down into the depths of her own guilt and despair. Try as she might to deny it, Victoria knew that she was not alone in the Maplewood home, that Mrs. Everhart's vengeful spirit lingered, waiting patiently for the moment when she would exact her terrible retribution. And as the nights grew longer and the shadows deeper, Victoria could feel the spectre of her mother-in-law drawing ever closer, her presence a harbinger of the darkness that awaited her. As the haunting of Mrs. Everhart intensified, Victoria found herself trapped in a nightmarish spiral of terror from which there seemed to be no escape. Every shadow, every whisper, served as a grim reminder of the horrors she had unleashed upon her mother-in-law, and now, it seemed, the time had come for her to pay the ultimate price. It was on a stormy night, with the winds howling like the tormented souls of the damned, that Mrs. Everhart's vengeful spirit made its final, terrible stand. As Victoria cowered in the darkness of her bedroom, she felt a cold hand wrap itself around her heart, squeezing with a vice-like grip that threatened to crush her very soul. In a blinding flash of rage and despair, Mrs. Everhart's ghostly form materialized before Victoria, her eyes burning with a fury that eclipsed the depths of hell itself. With a primal roar, she lunged at Victoria, her spectral hands reaching out to claim her as her own. In a desperate bid to escape, Victoria fled to the window, her heart pounding in her chest as she stared out into the abyss below. But there was no escape from Mrs. Everhart's wrath, no refuge from the sins that had brought her to this precipice of despair. With a savage strength born of vengeance, Mrs. Everhart pushed Victoria out the window, her screams echoing through the night as she plummeted toward the unforgiving pavement below. As her body struck the ground with a sickening thud, Victoria's world was consumed by darkness, her consciousness slipping away into the void. But the horrors that awaited Victoria in death were far worse than any she had endured in life. For as she lay broken and bleeding on the cold pavement, Mrs. Everhart's vengeful spirit descended upon her like a ravenous beast, her eyes ablaze with an infernal light. With a cruel efficiency, Mrs. Everhart chained Victoria's broken body and dragged her down into the depths of hell, where the fires of damnation awaited them both. And as they descended into the inferno, the screams of the damned mingled with the anguished cries of their tortured souls, a symphony of suffering that echoed through the darkness for all eternity. As the dawn broke over the Maplewood home, Robert awoke to a world shattered by tragedy. In the cold light of morning, he stumbled upon the gruesome scene that had unfolded in the darkness of night, his beloved mother's lifeless body lying broken and discarded, and his wife, Victoria, consumed by the fires of hellish vengeance. Tears welled in Robert's eyes as he knelt beside his mother, his heart heavy with grief and remorse. In that moment of reckoning, he realized the depth of his failure, the extent to which he had neglected his duty to protect his family. With trembling hands, he clutched Mrs. Everhart's lifeless form to his chest, his sobs echoing through the empty halls of their once happy home. In the quiet solitude of his despair, Robert grappled with the weight of his guilt, knowing that he could never undo the sins of the past. For in losing both his mother and his wife, Robert had lost more than just his family, he had lost a piece of himself, a piece that could never be reclaimed. And as he gazed upon the wreckage of his life, he knew that the road ahead would be fraught with pain and regret, haunted by the ghosts of his own failures.